The cross, an iconic symbol of Christianity, which has been used over 2,000 plus years in every tradition, in every denomination, in every consideration of what it means to be Christian. People wear it as jewelry. In some churches, like today, we carried a cross in at the beginning of the service. Most churches will have one on the altar or close to the altar. Maybe different traditions will do it differently. Some will have the body of Christ on it. Some may just have it as a plain wooden cross. I don't know, had you ever stopped and thought how strange it is that this universal symbol of Christianity is an instrument of torture, an instrument of execution, an instrument of degradation and inhumanity. Back in Jesus' time, in the Roman world, crucifixion was a means of execution that was used for those that were considered to be the worst sort of criminals, and was particularly used as a means of, I guess, deterrence. It was a means of execution that meant people hung on a cross and often took 2 to 3 days to die. It was painful, and it was inhumane. And I wondered how you'd feel if instead of carrying a cross in, we were carrying in a noose, or an electric chair, or a guillotine. We'd be offended. We'd think something was strange. And that's how many Christians, or many people in the early church times, felt about the cross. How could a means of execution, how could the place of execution of the worst type of criminal have anything to do with God or God's plan? How could God be killed on a cross? But something happens on the cross when Jesus dies. God does something which maybe we will never be able to fully understand. But it transforms that particular death and transforms that message and changes everything. And in the reading that we had in the gospel, Jesus is pointing forward to that particular death that he is going to suffer and doing his best to explain it. We didn't hear the rest of the reading, but if you remember the story of Nicodemus, at the beginning of chapter 3, Nicodemus is a rabbi, he's a well-known religious leader, and he comes to Jesus by night. He wants to find out more about Jesus' message. Maybe he's not sure whether he can do that during the daytime. He doesn't necessarily want everybody to know about it. But he is searching. He wants to find out something about what Jesus is saying. He wants to find out what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And you may remember that it's in that context that Jesus talks about being born again, about needing a spiritual rebirth. And maybe Nicodemus is being particularly obtuse, but he's a bit like, oh, I'm a grown man, how can you go back to be born again? Almost sort of throwing that idea of physical rebirth. Jesus goes, no, I'm talking about a spiritual rebirth. And it's in the context of that passage of Nicodemus searching. And I imagine that Jesus believes that Nicodemus is genuinely searching, that he takes him back to the Old Testament. And he reminds him of a story that he would have known really well as a rabbi, a story of Moses and the people of Israel in the wilderness and the time when this serpent is lifted up. Don't know whether you know the story, but basically the people of Israel in the Old Testament, they're traveling in the wilderness. They're on their way to the promised land. It's turning into an incredibly long journey. Something that could have been comparatively straightforward ends up taking over 40 years. And part of that is because the people of Israel are consistently arguing the case with God, consistently being disobedient or not wanting to go the way he goes. And there's a particular instance, and this is the only time it's referenced in the New Testament, when there's effectively a plague of snakes in the camp. They're venomous snakes, and as people are being bitten by these snakes, they're dying. And the Old Testament story suggests that this is to do with their disobedience. And Moses is like, God, you've got to do something about this. And God says, okay, I want you to make a bronze snake, and I want you to put it up on a pole high so that wherever you are in the camp, wherever you are, you can look at it. And then all you have to do if you're bitten is to look at the bronze snake and you'll be healed. All you'll have to do is look at the bronze snake and you'll be healed. And it's that story that Jesus is comparing his coming death to. It's an analogy for it. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness. By the way, I'm going to come back to it, but the image of image of a snake on a stick pole was around in other traditions as well, and is still used today as a caduceus. And it's a lot of doctors will wear them on the lapels because it's a sign of healing. That's the sort of underlying principle of it, that it's still a symbol of it's still a symbol of healing today. But just going back to the Old Testament one, in the Old Testament, what the people were asked to do was to look at a representation of what was causing them damage. They had to look at a bronze snake when it was snakes that were biting them. They had to look at and face the destruction they were facing. And that's all they had to do to be healed, to be saved, and to be restored. And what Jesus tells us in this reading as he speaks to Nicodemus about his coming death is, that's what it's like with my death on the cross. As Moses lifted up the serpent, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. You see, when we look at the cross, what we see is the face of evil. I don't mean Jesus, I just mean what's happening on the cross. We see the face of evil. We see the worst of humanity can do to other humans. We see the degradation they're prepared to cause each other. We see that weight. And what we're seeing is the full weight of what evil can do. And in the face of Jesus, we see God bearing the full weight of what that evil can do. The evil of, at the time, the Roman Empire. The evil of oppression. The evil of violence. The evil of scapegoating. God in Jesus, under the full weight of it all. And like looking at the snake in the Old Testament, when we see the cross, we're seeing the full weight of what sin can do. There's a verse in the Bible that says, the wages of sin, if you like, the wages of evil, is death. And we're seeing that, and we're brought face to face with it. And when we look at the cross, we're asked to see how that represents us as well. What is it in us that scapegoats? And so on. And when we see the extent of what evil can do, we realize that there's nothing we can do to heal ourselves, to save ourselves, to make ourselves better. We see just how self-destructive humanity is. And yet in the same place, we're offered the opportunity for healing, for salvation, and for restoration. Jesus' resurrection 3 days later seals the promise for us that the power of evil is completely broken by what he did on the cross. And we don't have to bear the full cost of the evil that exists. All we have to do is to look, see, and believe. I think what the cross does is it reveals how broken we are as human beings. It reminds us that we're part of the society, of the institutions that cause harm and damage to others. And yes, we can argue on a human level that some of us are better than others. But we're not being asked to look at that. We're asked to look at how we compare to God and to God's standards. This is love, says John. Not that we first loved God, but that he loved us and gave himself for us. So somehow on the cross, we get both a look at the brokenness of humanity, but we also get to see the total life-giving love of God. And in such, that instrument of torture somehow becomes a beacon of hope. Divine love and human frailty meeting on the cross. And so the cross becomes, I guess, a bridge to life in God. The passage we had in Philippians is linked to it because it's a beautiful piece of poetry. And it says this: be like Jesus, who, although he was God, didn't think that that was something to be used for his own advantage. Instead, he made himself nothing, took on the nature of a servant or a slave, took on human likeness, and humbled himself, being obedient to God, even to death, even death on a cross. And I think that extra line is to make that particular point, that not only did God in Jesus die and therefore understands for us what it's like to face death and to go through death, but he was prepared to die a criminal's death at the worst sort of place. And then it goes on, therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name. And the thing about that word exalted, and we think about that as being exalted up into heaven, is that the word lifted up in John, as the Son of Man will be lifted up on the cross, they're the same word. Jesus is exalted on the cross as he is exalted into heaven. He is lifted up. His glory, what worked, what achieved, happened on the cross. That's where God's love somehow wins. And I can't explain exactly how or exactly what, but it's God's willingness through love to suffer death and defeat it that gives each of us the opportunity for a bridge to new life. And so we have that verse that is perhaps one of the most quoted in the New Testament. So God loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes on him should not perish, but have everlasting life. I'm going to add that whilst it may be the most quoted, it's also often the one that's most quoted out of context, because people forget to mention the verses that have just come before it. But the word belief there is not about a theological understanding of what happens on the cross. It's the word in Greek pistios, which means relationship. Belief is grounded in relationship. It's our relationship with God that we see on the cross. So when we see him on the cross and we believe him, we're doing it because God loves us and we're responding to his love. We're not just looking at it and going, oh yeah, I understand there's a theological imperative here. That's what we sort of do in theology classes. You try and work out why. But the reality is that it's God's love that's brought him to that point. And it's God's love that we respond to. And that's a relationship. And it's his action on the cross, his loving and giving himself for us, that makes that relationship possible. If you've had kids, family, someone you care about deeply, you know that you are often willing to do anything for them. You would give up stuff for them. God does it for those of us who don't deserve it.